My name's Tim McDonald. I'm an architect, a builder, and a developer. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And a father in Philadelphia. Our company's a little different in that we're developers, first of all. We're architects, we're builders. We go out and physically build our own work. But essentially, I think I would call myself a maker and a teacher. I'd like to share a little bit about the whats, the whys, and the hows of our work in order to offer a couple of what-ifs to the conversation. Okay, it's working. We're obsessed with the new. I'm doing two things. With the novel. With the fresh, with the authentic, with the unbridled power of our own wills, to issue forth our creations from the spontaneous combustion of our own unique egos. Creating means making what does not already exist. Well, what if we stopped creating and started carefully reading? What if we then simply translated what we read and called that creating? What if invention came from the reconfiguring, the reconstituting, the rethinking of the given world around us? What if invention had nothing to do with making the new, but rather making the old anew? I don't mean this in a historic preservationalist sense. It's not about making the old again. It's about inventing the old. And the old is the existing stuff of the world around us that works. More simply, what if invention was first about just working with what you got? But you need to look for what you've got, for the givens, for what works around you. Enter the Philadelphia Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost house. One room per floor, amazing structures, 3 floors, staircase between, a compact, efficient, and ubiquitous typological nugget of urban space forming the basis of the Philadelphia urban fabric. So we love to look at these things. Quick and inexpensive to build and house people in the 18th and 19th centuries. Built in rows for maximum efficiency, and then in time extensions would be built to its rear, accommodating the growth of a family and urban infrastructure. So we say, okay, let's look at that. Isolate it, analyze it, imagining its extensions three-dimensionally. Let it take on many faces, occupy its extensions on all levels, occupy its roof, reposition it into a community of like-minded dwellings. Give it space to breathe, but not too much space. Weave green connective tissue between them. Ooh, hold on. Sorry, I'm ahead here and behind here. Welcome other typologies of urban dwelling, the row, the loft, the pavilion, and begin to form a community. A community rather than a collection of buildings. What if we only made communities rather than buildings? Communities that were dense, layered, that you could walk outside from every level. Communities that offered a sense of privacy and individuality, yet intimacy at the same time. Communities whose in-between spaces are as considered as the spaces themselves, where layers of color, surface, texture, light, and shadow evoked a sense of connectedness among people and things. Where thresholds between interior and exterior, public and private, constantly blur. Where a front and a back door are equally inviting, where it generates what it needs to survive. Independent, yet connected to a network. Where it captures every drop of water that lands within it, reuses more and consumes less. That's my brother. My brother is one of my partners, and he's a plumber. He doesn't like me to call him a plumber because he's so much more than that, but he's a plumber. And he loves water. And just a short story here, he said, I want to collect every bit of rainwater that falls on this site. And I said, that's a great idea. And he went to try to get a permit for it at the water department, and they said, we don't know what to tell you. It took him 6 months. He went into every department within Philadelphia, and they didn't know what to tell him. He ended up back at the same guy in the water department, and the guy said, just do it. And they gave him an award for it the next year. Where its roofs are planted living rooms, where it composts its own food waste into next year's fuel for its community vegetable garden. A community whose identity is entirely its own, one might even say unique, new, fresh, yet born of and absorbed into its larger parent context. And everywhere, as architects and developers and builders, we look, everywhere we look, we discover new fundamental building blocks of the city, ripe for exploration, inspiration, and reinterpretation. This time, through the equally ubiquitous row house. Lots of people know that typology, especially in DC and Baltimore. A thin slit of delightful, efficient, and longitudinal space that has remained a relevant model of urban dwelling for hundreds of years. So, why? Well, we first distill it to its essence as a line, as a thick line on a map, as a collection of thick lines that make thin spaces, as a thin slit of space, as a collection of thin slits of space. Thin spaces that reveal their thinnest dimension to the street and create a vertical rhythm and regularity to a block that communicates both a sense of connectedness as well as mystery. And the mystery is a mystery of density, of just how many people live here, of where one dwelling ends and where one begins. A city block, in general, blurs the lines between individuals in favor of a sense of community, a face or a facade that confounds a sense of individual identity and density to a place. Exploring that face, we consider how it might mask that sense of identity and density. We explore the thickness of this thin face further, how it conceals yet reveals its occupants behind, how it functions in several ways as a thick space that allows for outdoor balconies, staircases, as a light well for making a basement unbasement-like, as solar shading devices, as a thin space that confounds one's perception as to where one floor, one unit, or one property line begins and ends, attempting to evoke a sense of curiosity and wonder at the density or thickness of the community itself. A community whose identity is entirely its own. One might even say unique, fresh, new, yet born of and absorbed into its larger parent community. Where a front door and a back door are equally inviting. Where a vehicle comes with the home, like any other appliance. A fully electric vehicle, powered by the home. Where a parking lot is more like a sponge that absorbs all the rainwater and directs it into the ground rather than the treatment plant. In Philadelphia, as in many cities in the United States, all of the water that hits the ground goes into one pipe, the same pipe that your toilet water goes into. which means, and this is why my brother, as a plumber, wants to collect water, and so do we treat rainwater at our treatment plants. Bet you didn't know that. Another interesting story here about this electric car is that we got the city of Philadelphia, we went to our councilman and said, hey, this issue is parking in urban environments and putting garage doors on fronts of buildings, which is really stupid architecturally and urbanistically. We went to our councilman and we said, hey, what would you think about, similar to a handicap accessible sign, that if somebody was handicapped, they could get a sign and put it out in front of their home, and would you support an ordinance that would allow people to get an electric car parking only sign to put it outside their home? We thought he'd think we were crazy, but he didn't, and he passed this ordinance, and we think anything that works well needs to function in a couple of different ways. So this ordinance, not only does it promote electric vehicles, even though there aren't very many companies making electric vehicles at the moment, but it also saves the pedestrian sidewalk. There are no more parking garages, and so those are the kinds of ways that we connect with the city and have the city get inspired by what we're doing. Where it generates what it needs to survive. Why can't a building manage its own needs and resources? Why wouldn't it capture more and use less? Why would a roof shed water or radiant energy when it can capture it, absorb it, contain it, reuse it? Why wouldn't every roof in an urban environment become a garden? A garden that cools the home in the summer, triples the life of the roofing membrane because the sun isn't beating on it, allows occupants to grow their own food, manages its own stormwater. Oh, and it's a garden? Why wouldn't that roof also bring light into the center of this long, thin slit of space, filtering into every room in the home, eliminating not only the need for artificial lighting during the day, but the very idea of artificial lighting? Why do we need adjectives like green architecture, sustainable architecture, environmental architecture? To me, that's like distinguishing buildings with toilets in them as plumbed architecture, or buildings with lighting as electrified architecture, or buildings with heat as warm architecture. It's like, why wouldn't it just be architecture? And why wouldn't it just be thoughtful architecture, good architecture? I know why. Because, oh wait, let me back up. Oh boy, I want to back up too. I know why, because I'm impatient. I understand the need to speak about green architecture, but I'm impatient. And I know we need to educate, because even though I know the idea that buildings should be able to manage their own resources seems like common sense, but as Ben Franklin once said, common sense isn't all that common. So I don't know if anybody knows about the USGBC, the US Green Building Council, but they have created this very comprehensive green building system called the LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And it addresses, again, comprehensively, lots of things associated with buildings, from how they're sited to water, to energy, to materials, and where they come from, and indoor air quality, and so forth. In order to hold people to account for what it is they're making. I think it's a very important process and way of thinking about making buildings. The last project was the first LEED Platinum, the highest level that you can achieve, set of duplexes in the country in Philadelphia. And so it's important, but I think it's just a beginning for a society that typically doesn't work with what it's got, but rather takes what it wants until there's nothing left. So LEED is helpful, but it doesn't address in a radical manner what needs to be addressed, in my opinion, and that is energy. Why? Well, because buildings, the making of and operating of buildings, account for some of our most significant problems. The most amount of electricity that we used by buildings, close to 50% of the CO2 emissions that we have. I don't need to go through this, but basically, if we don't get our CO2 levels down by significantly by 2030, most experts say we're in a lot of trouble. And even with the alternative sources of fuel that we're working on, we're still a long way away from accounting for all of that CO2. So my question is, what if architecture could take that gray chunk on? How? How would they do that? Well, let's first ask a simple question. What's the best heating and cooling system out there in the world? Just somebody yell it out. Sun. Geothermal. Okay, I'll move it forward, but yeah, I mean, passive solar, active solar, PV, thermal, heat pumps, geothermal. That's what we do when we think of heating and cooling. We think of technology. We think of the stuff that makes heat and makes cooling. So what if we think less about the technology that consumes energy in order to make buildings warm and cool, and more about how a building can be like the earth and hold on to its heat? What if we thought more about a building's coat, its thermal envelope, before we think about its furnace? Why do we accept the fact that as much as 70%, this is unbelievable, 70% of the energy that we use, that buildings consume in order to make heating and cooling, literally goes out the windows and the walls and the doors? It's leaks out. Why do we accept that? Why? What if we simply kept what heat, is that right? Yeah. What heat we made inside? What if we just had a better coat? How much heat would we actually need? Our bodies are heaters. Our lights and our appliances are heaters. We'd be capturing more and consuming less. In fact, significantly less. This German building system called Passive House is what I'm really fascinated with these days, and it's fundamentally about radically reducing the need for energy in building based on how you think about its code. In fact, you could, by 90%, reduce the energy required in a building such that you could heat your building with what would be equivalent to a hairdryer. This isn't science fiction. This is insulation. And then let's go back and we'll talk about technology. We'll talk about that 10%. Now we only need 10% of what we needed before. Then you put a couple of solar panels on your roof, and buildings aren't consuming energy anymore. They're evening out or producing. What if we began to think about buildings that don't consume energy, but produced it? So, when we had the opportunity to test this, we got excited. An international competition with a simple challenging request. Design and build a highly sustainable building, completely designed and built for $150,000. Right up our alley. Thoughtfully designed, highly sustainable, small home, no premium associated with green or sustainable. Our approach was to limit the footprint, make it tiny, make it touch the ground in a very light way. And in so doing, it became this little tower. So we stretched it vertically. Then we carved it and oriented the mass towards the south. Then we carved out the interior so that it naturally cooled itself with what's called stack effect. This is in Syracuse, so the environment there can allow this to happen, and requires no mechanical cooling. Then give it a warm and airtight coat. Have it manage its own sewage with a low-tech constructed wetland that doubles as a vegetable garden in the summer. Make it flexible and capable of growing over time, growing from a 2-bedroom home to a handicap-accessible duplex, to a 3-bedroom home and office, to a 4-bedroom home, and so on, all within the same envelope. This little power-packed house. Have it meet the street as its neighbors do. Imagine it as a prototype to be repositioned and reoriented on different sites with different attire, where a front and a back door are equally inviting. A building whose identity is entirely its own, one might even say unique, yet born of and absorbed into a larger parent community. So, lastly, our last project, we'll run through this quickly because I'm being told to wrap it up. Sometimes the given condition that we get is what someone else leaves behind. This was an old stable, is an old stable in the center of Philadelphia, a densely packed residential community, almost an entire block. And this is what the developer gave us, the previous developer. It replicates a classic Philadelphia block of rows with the removal of any and all private green space in the service of a drive aisle between the two sides of the block. The individual homes step away from each other in order to claim some degree of open space through roof decks and balconies. Nothing terribly inspiring, but we took it for what it was, raw material for reconsideration. Look for what works and what doesn't. So we first said, carve out community space from the south. A perfectly reasonable unit, the urban dwelling space, work with the row, but isolate it. Flip them on their heads and make them speak to each other. Grow them. Shift them for further engagement. Warehouse the car, make it subordinate to the community space rather than vice versa. Begin to link, stitch, join the blocks together. Repeat. Turn a problem into an opportunity. The site is one of the lowest sites in the city, frequently floods. We went to the city, we said, hey, how about if we put a 400,000-gallon tank underneath our site? Would it do anything? Their engineers did their calculations. They came back and they said, it would stop a 25-year flood. We said, great, do you like the idea? They said, yeah. We said, would you pay for it? They said, and they finally said, yeah, but it's infrastructure. But then we said, okay, well, it not only connects the stormwater that's coming from the streets, but it captures all the water from the site. And then what it does, at that point, we said, okay, we have this resource, it's amazing, let's really make it work. Let's use this wastewater as a geothermal heat sink to heat and cool the building and significantly reduce the very expensive geothermal wells that go down 400 feet in the process. And let's allow this thing to generate what it needs to survive, independent yet connected. And then let's think about how it's built in a much more efficient manner in a factory that we've recently started, where we translate the efficiency of building into a high-performance building envelope. Articulate the facade so that each unit shifts and jogs in order to create private exterior balconies and gardens, but create a space to gather, a garden, performance space, a stage set for the possibility of community. A community whose identity is entirely its own. One might even say unique, fresh, new, yet born of and absorbed into its larger parent community. A community that is stitched, linked, joined together within 4 stories of what we call these floating courtyards, circulation and opportunities for encounter, whether they like it or not. So what if? What if we all worked with what we've got, more or less? Thank you.